We're living in a very information-heavy world. There's always new findings, new studies, and sometimes we just believe them because they're true, right? But it can be really hard to find and know for certain if this information is accurate or misleading. Along come conflicting findings, and over time, you just don't know what to believe anymore. So what can we do? Hey guys, welcome back to Dose of Joy. Today I wanted us to discuss how to find studies that we can actually trust and differentiate them from other studies that are potentially misleading. Oftentimes, where we get this information from, or the studies themselves and how they were carried out, can affect how much we should believe them. And one of the main purposes of this channel is to give you information and resources so that you can make informed decisions by yourself. And in this case, to know what online information such as health claims and scientific findings to trust. And for those who don't know, I recently graduated from Bachelor of Science, majoring in physiology. And essentially, during my whole degree, I was required to find studies, articles that were to be trusted and that I could use to back up my own research. So, let's begin. First, I'm going to start with how we actually consume the information about health. A lot of it is on the news on TV, and now with social media, you can like a news page and automatically get posts onto your feed. I know with a lot of studies they post, people just take the piss out of it, but there are always going to be some that end up believing it and probably sharing it with people they know. The first thing we need to be aware of is how the media writes the titles of the articles. While they're not common, you may come across articles that say X causes Y, or X causes this, which causes Y. And I would personally recommend taking that with a grain of salt. And that's sort of being generous. Because in science we're taught it's just really hard to prove whether something causes something else. Especially on such a large scale thing like eating this type of food will cause this to happen, because there is so much else going on in our bodies that we can't possibly prove that something definitely causes something else. So it's always recommended to be a little bit skeptical, because in this case, skepticism is pretty valid. Instead, it's better to approach these titles with the mindset that, okay, I don't think it causes this, but maybe X could contribute to Y. So for example, instead of saying eating this will cause diabetes, it will say eating this can increase the likelihood that you're going to get diabetes. They're completely different. So I came across this study on 7 News, which we'll be using as our main example in this video, mainly because I actually found it pretty funny, but it's a pretty good example. The title is, Teens Who Don't Date Better Off Than Teens Who Do, New Study Reveals. So what I sort of dislike about this title is that it's almost asserting that students who don't date are better off than teens who do, instead of could be better off. You can see in the actual article that the authors word it like this, that adolescents who weren't dating fared better or equal to peers who dated. So that there's variability in the results that they got, that people who didn't date versus people who do tended to be equal as well. But that's not catchy. That's not a catchy title, and I don't think that would hook many people. So of course they have to make it a bit more punchy, as opposed to, it could, because no one's gonna click on it. And the second thing, apart from titles, to be aware of, is that most media articles will only reference one study. So I'm really glad in this particular article that it emphasizes new study reveals, meaning that there's only one study that proves this. I'm sure there are plenty of media articles out there that have a very bold statement but only reference or look at one study. So I'm sure you guys who have written papers have all been told to cite at least 4 references or something more than one, for sure. And that's because if we're only going to reference one thing, we've only got one perspective to base it on, and that makes your findings very limited. It's the same as relying only on one online review and ignoring all the rest for something that could be potentially dangerous to your health. If at least a few studies have generally the same findings or similar findings, then you're more likely to know to trust it. So now that we've looked into how media can actually portray these studies, let's look at the studies themselves. And to make it easy, we're going to look at the same study from before. So first of all, unfortunately, unless if you're a uni student who can access the uni database, a lot of the times you have to pay for the full article. But that's fine because each study will still give a brief overview that's free for everyone to access. So when you're looking at the study itself, it's very common to look at things like how recent the article was published. So if it's back in 2000, it's very unlikely that things would have stayed the same as if a study was released in 2019. So generally, the more recent the study, the better. And also whether the authors themselves have credentials, whether they can be trusted to make these claims. But other lesser known things to check to see if a study is valid include who funds the study, the sample selected, the type of study design, and whether the study is peer reviewed, and the methods the researchers use in their study. Of course, there are other things to check to see whether something is misleading or not, but generally I find that these do most of the job. So number 1, who funds the study? Research is expensive. You have to pay for the materials, you have to pay for the researchers themselves, among other things. So the majority of studies are funded by the government, organizations, or random companies. And I personally think that this is one of the easiest things to check to see whether to trust this study or not. So for example, let's look at this article again. With articles, you'll definitely know who funds it quite easily. They'll put it somewhere on the page for you to see. And here it seems to be funded by the National Centre for Injury Prevention and Control. So that's pretty standard, and I don't have any problems with that. But if it's funded, for example, by the Department of Anti-Relationships, then you can see where this would go. Same goes for a study like this one that's testing cacao flavanol, a natural compound found in cacao plants. The only problem is, though, that this compound which produces chocolate is funded by Mars Inc. You can take this how you'd like. So this would be my first point of call, just knowing who's funding it and therefore who could be affecting the results. Number 2, samples selected in the study. So of course, each study needs participants, and altogether they're known as the sample of the study. Generally with samples, I look at the sample size as well as the diversity of the sample. So in the study, it has a total of 594 participants, and that's a very, very decent amount of people. I don't know if there's a legal rule as to how many participants a study needs to have, but generally if it only has a sample size of 30 and it's supposed to represent the whole country, that is a huge red flag. But alongside sample size, I also look at the diversity of the sample. Though sometimes you do want the sample to be controlled, for example, in an experiment that tests whether chocolate increases risk of heart disease in middle-aged men. One group would be the middle-aged men eating chocolate, and then the other one would be a control. But in both groups, you do want the physiology of men to be as similar as possible. But in the study that we're looking at, because a claim is so broad and there's not a particular product that we're testing, I'd want the sample to be as diverse as possible. In this study, they're all from Georgia, America, which really makes it very hard to generalize across countries. It could be that relationship dynamics in Georgia are quite different to those in other countries. If this was a study that was done internationally as well, or even interstate, then that would have been a lot more credible. Number 3, the type of study or research design and whether it's peer-reviewed. So study designs are basically how the study has been carried out. And the reason why I bring it up is because I find that some designs are more useful than others, depending on the scientific topic that I'm looking at. So for example, if I wanted to look into a health topic like omega-3 and its impact on our health, I will actually look towards something like a systematic review. So this is where the author or the authors will collate a collection of studies that talk about the same topic and then evaluate it based on the findings. I find these super useful because the author has done the hard part for you. They found different studies which offer different perspectives, and they summarize it in a very understandable way. So definitely, if you want to save a bit of time, consider looking at systematic reviews. And just a side note, this doesn't mean to trust all systematic reviews. The authors can easily bias the findings based on the studies that they choose, but if you've checked some other things on this list, then chances are you'll be okay. I also did mention the importance of peer reviews. This just means that an article is assessed by a range of scientists in that particular field to make sure that the article is valid and is of high quality. This doesn't completely guarantee, though, that the study will be reliable because of things like subjectivity or bias, but generally if you do see that a study has been peer-reviewed, then it's more likely to be trusted than something that hasn't. And finally, number 4, the methods used to find the results. In the study we've been looking at, The students who did date and those who didn't were compared to based on their leadership, social skills, and depression, as well as their suicidal ideation. What I felt a bit skeptical about though was that the teachers of the students were asked to give these reports via questionnaires, which means that the findings in the study depend on how the teachers rate the students based on things like depression. Personally, I think this is a bit of a stretch because how a student can display feelings of depression can be different to what the teacher thinks. And also, this could be affected by how much the student likes the subject, whether they're engaged or not, and that could be misinterpreted as depressive. There were also questionnaires directed to the students as well, but I think expanding it to include friends of the students who would know their friends based on a setting outside of the classroom would make the findings a lot more accurate. And the fact that all of the findings were based on questionnaires is a little bit iffy for me, especially because the students weren't anonymous when filling these questionnaires out, so maybe they might not want to express just how depressed they are or whatever. And while I don't think that questionnaires are the most reliable, this sample size is almost 600, so I could imagine why they chose questionnaires over other methods. So to sum up, you might be wondering whether this study is to be trusted or not. I personally think that this study is quite valid, that it was carried out with a big sample size, that's funded by the right people, but I wouldn't trust it just yet because this is just one study that tackles this topic. So as frustrating or cliche as it is, this definitely needs more research in order to see whether this finding is correct or not, or can be trusted or not. And also do remember that this is only set in Georgia, USA, so I mean, depression and stuff could be linked to other reasons, perhaps? But yeah, anyway, so obviously we don't have all the time in the world to research this much into depth with every study. But even just being aware of things like who funds the study, how sensationalized the media makes the article seem, these are all really good steps forward. I hope this really makes it easier to see how research is presented to the public, and also that you're more confident yourself to weed out the studies that may or may not seem a bit misleading. Awesome! So that's done, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!